Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content, whether it be our short form content, or our full length content. We're now in around the third week of the NBA. So, we have some serious things to talk about. I think things are starting to heat up. I think we're starting to see, the contenders, maybe some of the pretenders, but that's probably going to be down the line. But I think, the early season stuff is kind of interesting. So we're going to talk about that in this episode. But before we get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OPT Podcast for more content and updates.
So we're now, basically like on our way through the third week of the NBA season. We had a return of the NBA the other day, right? Obviously, on Tuesday there were no NBA games, but
Mm-hmm.
on Wednesday, pretty much almost every team played. There were a ton of games. Of course, we'll start, I guess with two of the nationally televised ones.
Yeah,
Um, and that was the Spurs and the Knicks, right? With Wembanyama making his debut at Madison Square Garden. The Knicks ended up running away with that game 126-105. I mean, I don't think that's too much of a shocker that the Knicks are a better team
right.
than the Spurs. I was curious to see how Wembanyama would play in his first game. It was a pretty rough game. 4-14. Did have 9 rebounds and a block, 14 points, minus 25. Maybe there were some nerves there because again, the Garden is considered, one of the, you know, pillars of places to play,
Right.
professional basketball and, just in terms of the history of the arena. Um, but still, again, just also with the Spurs, he had some rough situations in terms of injuries, right? Like Devin Vassell, he just came back. He only played 12 minutes and they were off the bench. Because they were kind of on a groove, at one point, where they won, I think, 3 in a row or so,
Yeah,
before he went out. And then, he went out and, it had been a little bit tough for them. He'll be easing his way back.
I think they were
Sohan's been
three and
playing at
two
the
at that
point.
point.
Yeah, exactly. Sohan's been playing at the point guard. He's been playing better, I think. And again,
Absolutely.
like we mentioned with the Scoot thing, playing point guard is a rough transition. And especially for a guy like a Sohan who wasn't a point guard at all,
Right.
pretty much, in any capacity. Obviously he could pass somewhat, but still, I think he's been playing better as a point guard, making better reads, just getting more comfortable. It will take time.
And Pop
I'm
even
still
said
not
that's an experiment too.
right, exactly. I'm still not sure like if long term that's what you would want to do. But again, just the fact that he's making progress in it and getting more comfortable with it, I think is a solid sign.
Yeah.
For the Spurs going forward. Because again, when your point guard is more comfortable, then that helps everybody. Because that's the thing with Wembanyama is, without like a traditional point guard out there, it's gonna be at times a little bit difficult for him. Because even though he can bring up the ball and create offense, the easiest offense is being able to play off of other guys, right? Like
Right.
pick and roll, like dump offs around the basket, post entry passes. And that stuff is just going to be a little bit rough. And the Spurs are not like a great 3-point shooting team either. So there's going to be times where they can kind of shrink the floor and just kind
Exactly.
of convert on it. And
And I
the
think
Knicks are, kind of like, what?
Sorry, I was just going to say one thing about the Spurs. I think, the goal with the Sohan experiment is probably to see, if he can even do it, long term, like you were saying. And if he can do it long term, then they don't need to look for a guy, in the draft, say that, or, free agency. They don't need to look to pick up, like a more traditional point guard because they'll have Sohan.
Exactly. And then, you look at the Knicks, right? Like it's a big physical team. So that's the kind of matchup where like it may be a little bit tough. For a guy like Wembanyama. I mean, again, you got Mitchell Robinson, Julius Randle kind of had a semi bounce back game, 8 for 19, but still
Yeah.
23 and point, 16 rebounds, 5 assists. RJ Barrett came as, he's come back and he's looked really good. His 3-point shooting has been really impressive, I think, to start off the year.
Yes.
Again, the Knicks are 500 right now. So I think there's still some work to be done on the margins, but um, overall, like I said, it would have been nice to have seen a game where Wembanyama went off. But
Yeah.
again, the Spurs are not necessarily like a great team. Again, I think they're going to be way more competitive than they were last year. But still, it's a young team. There's going to be a lot of ups and downs, ebbs and flows. So I don't think you can be too mad. And with the Knicks, we'll see where this goes. But again, Randall, he needs to be better, and he was better last night, and hopefully he can kind of continue to bounce back because we
Yeah.
we mentioned it in the previous podcast where I think, he had gotten off to one of the worst starts ever.
Yeah. Shooting toward eights. It was bad. And, 8 for 19 is still a toward eight to me. But regardless, this is better than what it was before. And I'm glad, RJ Barrett came back and actually gave Brunson some help because Brunson did play well too. So,
Right. And then, in the second game, Nuggets Warriors, kind of an interesting game, right? Maybe potentially like a, you know, deep playoff matchup,
Sure,
maybe, possibly.
I agree.
Um, and the Nuggets ended up pulling away 108, 105. Obviously, some key guys out, right, for the Warriors. No Draymond, no Gary Payton II. And then for Denver, no Jamal Murray, who's going to be out for apparently multiple weeks,
Yeah,
at least 3 to 4. That's pretty rough. Um,
yeah. I think they said a
you know,
month. Yeah, a complete month is what
yeah,
they said. They're gonna
yeah,
sideline
exactly.
him for the hamstring
Right.
injury. I think.
Exactly, yeah, and you can't mess around with a hamstring
Nope.
injury because a guy could come back, early and then tweak it, and then before you know it, they're out for a few weeks again.
Yep.
It started off early in the first quarter. It looked like the Nuggets were just gonna kind of just pull away, but the Warriors battled back really through the strength of their bench, and that's kind of been their main thing this year, where their starters have not really like played that great as a unit,
Hmm.
and then the second unit has kind of come in and clean things up. Like if you look at the plus minuses. Only two guys for the Warriors had, a plus minus that wasn't in the negative double digits, right? Like,
Right.
you look at Curry -10, Clay -13, Sarge -12, Looney and Wiggins -6. Wiggins, that's a guy who's also, been really bad, I think,
Yeah.
to start the year. Um, and I don't think he's that bad, so we'll see him pick it up. And then you look at the bench guys, Kaminga +9, Trace Jackson Davis, that was a guy we liked coming into the draft, +4,
Yeah.
+5 for Chris Paul, +6 for Moses Moody, +8 for Pojemski. I mean, kind of an interesting group and mix of guys. It feels like the Warriors have made some real improvements and feel like that they're, a lot better this year, or at least a more serious team than they were last year.
Sure.
Um, but the Nuggets pulled it out, and it still kind of feels like, there's some limitations there. Because I think we've heard a lot of people talk about, sort of a theory behind why they feel like the Warriors are a team that could best the Nuggets. Mainly because you have a guy in Steph that can, pull Jokic away from the rim,
Sure.
and that kind of opens the floor and allows for Golden State to get a lot more layups. But it still feels kind of like a Warriors Lakers last year type of matchup where there's still some deficiencies in terms of size, and it just feels like over the course of a game, especially like when guys get probably kind of fatigued late into the game, you could tell like Golden State they played really hard for a lot of the game and then kind of just ran out of gas. And Denver just kept on kind of cruising because of that size. Jokic, where it didn't even feel like Jokic really had a good game
Yeah.
for a while, but he still finished with 35 and
Yeah.
13. He was 1 of 8 from three, which is bad. Missed a couple free throws late, which was bad. I think Steph he missed the layup also. So it was kind of a weird thing between
True.
their
The
two stars.
floater.
And
Yeah.
a matchup of two guys that have played great to start off the season.
Yeah. Exactly.
Both Denver pulled it out, and I do feel like they've kind of established themselves as the best. Well, not kind of, they have established themselves as the best team. I'm curious to see how they handle things with Jamal Murray out, because the bench did not look very good um, in this game. I
Yeah.
think some of the second unit guys didn't play very well, but also Golden State's second unit clearly is much better.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but it didn't matter because in the end, the starters ended up playing much better, and those were the guys that closed, and those were the guys that played well, and those are the guys you're going to rely on, come playoff time. Right? You're not
Yeah.
going to be playing, these all these bench guys like 15 minutes a night. Those guys may not. Some of those guys may not even play.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and
So
it's kind of interesting. I feel like, both these teams are in interesting spots because I think we're going back to narratives that have kind of ridden these teams for a while now. I feel like, with Denver, the question always was, when will Jamal Murray actually be healthy? So, when he's missing time, I think that is cause for concern for them because I think we all know that they're not quite the same team without Jamal Murray. And I think, that's something that they need to keep an eye on. And then with the Warriors, it comes down to the youth and how well are these guys going to gel? Because I feel like the Chris Paul thing, it hasn't necessarily looked amazing yet, quite yet. It hasn't panned out. I don't think quite the way that they want it to. But they are 6-3, so I don't think there's any like reason to be raising our eyebrows at it because he's doing his job. It just doesn't look
yeah,
the prettiest because he's just
I
old
think
now.
I think there's just going to be some matchups where you're probably just not going to be able to close with him. And
I agree.
Draymond wasn't playing, so, like a night like tonight. Maybe Chris Paul doesn't close, and they just go with like a more traditional closing five.
Sure.
Because like you watch Chris Paul and like again, like you look at the counting stats: 9 points, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, not bad.
Right.
4 of 10, 1 of 4 from three, and he's been shooting pretty horrible. But like
Yeah.
he couldn't really shake Jokic. Who's not necessarily like a super speedster, big man, but
No, not at all. Far from
again,
it.
Right, yeah. It's like, like you said, there are 6-3 despite some weird things like Wiggins forgetting how to play basketball,
Right?
Steph being a turnover machine. But,
Yeah.
like, it hasn't mattered. They've still been able to win games. They did have a couple of game winners, but regardless, it does feel like, the vibe for that team is a lot better than it was
Yeah.
last year. It
They're
still
strong.
feels like and I think that will pay dividends as you get, later in the season because 'cause they're already 4-2, I think, or whatever it is on the road, which,
Yeah.
again, that's pretty close to how many road games they won all of last year. That's
Which is
yeah,
crazy
so
to
that's
think
all
about. Imagine if they actually won road games last year.
right, exactly. So that's already a huge improvement.
Absolutely.
Um, so I think there's reason for optimism there. But
Mhm.
again, ultimately, can you get through the buzzsaw that's Denver? I don't know because it still feels like size-wise, there's just gonna be some issues
Right.
because it just feels like, again, at the end of games, Denver can kinda just get whatever they want, right? Like, Looney's a really good defender, and there were times where he actually did do a very good job of guarding Jokic, and then there were other times where it just didn't matter, where he was just shooting over him, and that's gonna be an issue even if, regardless of whether or not it's Draymond or Looney guarding him, even though those
Right.
guys are physical guys, with long reach and they're smart, you're still gonna have the problem of like he can just kind of get any shot he wants. And then, even if he's playing way up high, like you have Aaron Gordon who can kind of be a cheat code where he can kind of play in the back and kind of, you know, replicate some of that kind of stuff using his size and athleticism. Because against a team like this, he's basically one of the biggest players on the floor,
Exactly. And
even though
everybody's a
he's a power.
cutter on that team. So, it's a
Right.
free game in the
And
paint.
even like right, and a Michael Porter Jr., that's another guy, who so far this season I think has done a really solid job in terms of doing other things other than just scoring. Like you can see him, being an impactful guy by
Sure.
rebounding the ball, by
Absolutely.
sometimes playing defense. Obviously sometimes the shot selection is still kind of wild, but
Right.
just overall, like, he looks pretty solid, I think, for Denver in terms of like just his all around game. And I think that kind of speaks volumes about again, if that kind of progression is legit, right, then that makes Denver, even better than they would have already been. So
Yeah, exactly. I agree with everything that you said, and I feel like Denver. We've talked about this. They are the hunted now. They're no longer the hunter. I'm curious who's gonna be the hunter. In the Western Conference. I think we've got a ways till we know that for sure because
yeah,
feel like some teams haven't played up to their full potential. I'm sure we'll get to that in a minute.
yeah.
But yeah, Denver is definitely the team to chase, and it seems like they've been internally improving, which is something that we were kind of banking on them to be doing, since they didn't have the greatest of free agencies.
Right. Yeah, and then moving on to another team that I think has also played pretty well. That's Minnesota, right? They got a win, big win. Well, not big win. I mean, it was a shorthanded Pelicans
Yeah.
team, but still, like, they won 122-101 over New Orleans. They are 5-2. They have the best defense in the NBA.
Yes.
Led by, Anthony Edwards, Towns, Gobert, McDaniels, that starting five, with some guys off the bench. Edwards, this was a guy that we talked about in terms of taking a leap, and I feel like he's definitely taken a leap. I
Yep. It's
think
there.
what you see the most is the passing playmaking. When you compare it to what we saw, in the previous seasons,
Hmm.
like I think that's kind of the aspect where like if he can get that going, that's where he can kind of unlock the superstardom. He's averaging, 5 assists, over 5 assists a game, which is obviously the most in his career.
Yeah.
And that's something where again, like if he can do already all of the offensive stuff in terms of as a scorer, and then now he can kind of get other guys involved and make other guys better. That's the part where now he kind of becomes like that superstar type player. And they also got like we hadn't mentioned it, but they got like a huge one where they blew out Denver. That's the only loss Denver's had this season.
And they
And
beat the
that kind of
Celtics
speaks
in
to the hype.
overtime, I think.
Right, and they got a win over the Celtics in overtime as well. So they've looked really good, I think, to start off the season. And like I said, it's led by Edwards. You've also had some bounce back performances. I think Gobert this year has been a lot better than he
Yeah.
was last year. And just on both ends of the floor in terms of his impact, right? Again, they got the number one defense.
Hmm.
McDaniels has been a little bit of a slow start because he came in, with an injury,
Yep.
been in a little bit of foul trouble, and minutes restriction and all that. But, he played 26 minutes the other night, plus 18, right? Again, doing things on both ends of the floor.
Hmm.
Again, this looks like a good team.
Yeah. How about
In
Nas
terms
Reed
of
off the bench too?
yeah, exactly. In terms of being, better than last year, again, we'll see come playoff time where that success lies.
Hmm.
But the first step towards, more playoff success is being a better regular season team, even
Right.
though we've seen, some weird stuff within the regular season. But it feels like a team that has taken, a step forward in terms of being more comfortable and some guys just getting better. And that's kind of what you needed from Minnesota because there wasn't a whole lot of flexibility to do much else with the roster outside of like, a big trade like a Towns or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, they look really mature. Definitely hyped for this team. I think this is one of the teams to watch. Hey, who knows? They could be one of the hunters. I think that could be something to watch. Because
Of
they
course,
have,
last
huh?
you had a dark horse last year.
Exactly. I had them as a dark horse last year, and they completely let me down and flamed out. But it is cool that they seem to be putting it together, and I think they had a decent start last year too. But hopefully they can keep this up. And Gobert looks the part, like you said. Anthony Edwards seems like he's coming into his own, and then Town seems to have figured out his role in some cases. So I think this is a good team. Like you said, albeit they they did beat a New Orleans team that didn't really have much going for them. I think McCollum is out and Zion, I think, as
Yeah,
well. So
yeah, but they still had some huge victories over teams like
exactly.
Denver and Boston. So
Yes. That Boston game was
yeah,
crazy.
right. And then going back to New Orleans, it just feels kind of unfortunately like, the same song and dance where guys are hurt. Now I know Zion, I think he's out for personal reasons,
Yeah.
not injury.
Hmm.
But McCollum, we hadn't mentioned it, but he had, the collapsed lung
Yeah.
thing going on. So now so hopefully he can, bounce back from that.
Yeah.
Personally, even outside of basketball, just
Right.
hopefully he can continue to bounce back from that. But with New Orleans, right? Now they're 4-4 again. Not panic time, obviously for
No, no.
sure. But again, guys are out already. And some of these guys will be back, I think, soon. I think Jose Alvarado is supposed to be back within a week or so. Jordan Hawkins, I think, has been pretty solid. In
Yes,
terms of
I
filling
agree.
in. Dyson Daniels, I think, has done a decent job as well. But they not necessarily a cause for concern, but they started the year off good. So I feel like when their main guys are out there, it feels like a good team, which is what we thought. It's just again, they just got to continue to stay healthy. And
Yeah.
some of these other role players have helped them. Even like a guy like a Matt Ryan, who was, kind of an afterthought,
Forgot
to
about him.
begin
Yeah.
in terms of like because I think remember he was initially on that Lakers team that was 2-10
Yeah.
at the beginning of the year, and he kind of just came out of nowhere and then moved on and didn't really play elsewhere after that. But now he's a real rotational player for them.
Yeah.
And again, like other guys, like I mentioned, Jordan Hawkins, Dyson Daniels, these are important players, especially again, um, Trey Murphy, right? He's out, right? That's a guy where like you need, when he comes back, he's really helpful. Herb Jones, right? He's out right now due to
Yep.
injury as well. So you kind of have a skeleton crew out there right now. So you just kind of have to hold on. But I feel like we have seen, at least early on, some decent signs where if they have all their guys or most of their guys, this is a good team, I think.
Yeah, and that's kind of been the story, ever since Zion's been there. Is like, when healthy, this team is nice. They're a good team to watch. I think they're really just banking on, like you said, Hawkins and Dyson Daniels to really step up in the absence of some of their really, really good players that can easily get them in a, higher seed in the West come playoff time, I think.
Yeah. Moving on, right? We got the Miami Heat and the Memphis Grizzlies, right? Not too much about the Grizzlies, right? We've already kind of,
Yeah.
talked about them, just with the guys out, and it's going to be really hard for them to win a lot of games. But with the Heat, they had a couple of wins to kind of get back to 500 right after a start to the year, right? They had a win over the Lakers and a win over the Grizzlies. Um, but unfortunately, Tyler Hero, he got hurt in this game.
Yeah.
And now he's supposed to be out for, at least a few weeks with the grade 2 ankle sprain. And he was actually playing very well to start off the season. He was averaging like 25, 5
Yeah.
and 5. Obviously, there was, remember he was in those trade rumors, and I'm sure he was probably not happy being included
Yeah.
in those trade rumors. But he wanted to play well, he wants to show out. It sucks that he got hurt.
Yeah, really
We'll
though.
see because they had some other injuries as well. They've had a couple of guys, come in. Jaquez Jr. I think has been relatively solid.
Mhm.
Um, and then you look at some of these other guys, right? Like, Lowry started off slow, but he's had a couple of decent games.
Sure.
Bam, I think, has been really good.
Yes.
Jimmy's been, what he normally does in the regular season. So, how do you feel about the Heat, like
Mm.
kind of going in right now? Because again, they started off kind of rough. They bounced back, a little bit, and now they're 500. It still feels like they're still missing some stuff to be at the top, but it doesn't seem like the drop off is as horrible as I think what it might have felt like, post not having Lillard, but
Right.
still feel like they're not quite where I'd like them to be.
Yeah, I feel like we might have gotten baited into some recency bias, after witnessing the play of Struess and Gabe Vincent, and it's like, yeah, like you said it multiple times throughout the past couple of weeks, is those guys didn't really do much for them in the regular season. It was more so the postseason play that elevated their games. But looking at it now, it's like the roster isn't horrible. Now that we're really looking at it, now that we get to see it in action, I think Tyler Hero stepping up and being the player that he has been the past few weeks has definitely helped them in terms of getting some actual wins and securing it. But the problem with the Miami Heat is you can't write them off. Like you can never really write them off too early. I feel like we'd have to be able to talk about them a little bit later on when they're way out of playoff contention to really say this was a wash or they're done. But I feel like if they're even an eighth seed, we've seen it happen last season. They got to the finals as an eighth seed, so. Right now, I'm not concerned about them. I think they'll bounce back as long as they're healthy. And, this is a team that rallies and has some fight in it all the time. But it is kind of concerning when you're going up against Memphis and you only win by 6 points because Memphis pretty much doesn't really have much going for it right now.
Yeah. Bucks Pacers just wrapped up,
Yeah.
shortly before I think we started talking. Giannis had 54 and 12, but ultimately, unfortunately, they did lose to the Pacers. Now they were without Damian Lillard.
Okay.
The Pacers now are 6-3. To begin the season. Because with the Bucks, they started off a little slow. They've gotten some more wins. They've looked a little better.
Yeah.
But this is more so about the Pacers. Um, you look at the numbers, right? Tyrese Halliburton, 29 and 10. Benedict Mathurin with a bounce back game, 26 and 11. This was a guy that we talked about in our previous podcast, where he was a guy that was kind of in a sophomore slump. But again, huge bounce back performance. Miles Turner with 21 and 6. Um, Andrew Nemhard and Buddy Hield, with some shooting, I guess, at times.
Yeah.
But overall, with the Pacers, they look better. I mean, the defense is still not necessarily amazing. But the offense is just ridiculous, where it feels like, there have been multiple games where it feels like they have 100 points after 3 quarters. I'm not necessarily sure if that's like a sustainable playoff thing, but I think at least for the regular season, which is I think where they're kind of focused in more so right now. It's something that I think, if you're the Pacers, again, this is a team that I thought had a really good offseason. I think you thought they had a really good offseason. I thought that they would, I think I had them over on the over under. I think you had them a little bit under.
Yeah.
Just because we weren't necessarily sure how much of a leap they would take. I thought it would be like maybe a few games more, but so far, I really like the look of this team in terms of again, just the amount of talent, at a number of different positions. And again, this is a team where they also, were without a couple other guys, right? Like Jalen Smith has had a decent year for them. Right, that was a guy, that was kind of an afterthought at one point, right, where he was drafted by Phoenix. The year they went to the finals, and he really didn't do anything for them. Then they got rid of him, and then he ended up playing better and looking like a more productive player.
Right.
And then Jarius Walker, right? That was a guy who was their lottery pick, and he's not really played at all. He's not even part of the rotation. But
Yeah.
just in general, like, how do you feel about this Pacers team? Do you feel like they're better than what you initially thought?
Yeah.
Or are they about as good as what you thought? Or like, just in general, what do you think?
Yeah, they've been playing on a phenomenal level. Offensively, I love everything that they're doing, and it all starts with Halliburton. This is a guy that I came out and said I thought he was going to have a breakout year, an even better one than last year. I think everything starts with him because as long as he's facilitating the ball, I think everybody's going to be able to eat and feast. Like you see Miles Turner beasting, you see Mathurin, a guy who we really weren't that high on last week. Now he's looking like he's looking better. So it's interesting. I think Halliburton has that floor general factor, and I think it all starts with him. And then adding Obi Toppin, I think, is an underrated move. I think this is a guy who can easily flourish in this offense. So I love everything that Indiana's done. Even Bruce Brown, like I know like sometimes his stats don't look the greatest, but it's more about the impact. Like, if you look at the rebounds, the assists, the steals, the blocks, the defense. But
Yeah.
then, you look at the offense, it's like, okay, it could be a little shaky, but it doesn't matter because they got the win. That's the kind of team that I
Swiss
think this is.
Yeah, he's a Swiss Army knife for sure.
Exactly.
Kind of earning every penny of that contract
Yes.
that he got so far. Now I guess we're not gonna go into every game right at this point. I think we're gonna kind of like close out this part of the podcast. With 3 more games. We'll start with Philly Boston before we get to the 2 LA teams. So
Okay.
we'll start off with Philly, right? Who's 6-1, 106-103 win over Boston. Post Harden trade, the team has looked pretty good.
Bro, they look
Um,
amazing.
It's actually kind of funny because this was a thing where when this trade was first made, I think we liked it for Philly, from the perspective of you get rid of the Harden drama while also kind of bringing in some guys that play positions of need, guys that you kind of needed, to fill, holes in the roster, right? Because they didn't really have any great options on the wings,
Yep.
um, and that was something that definitely killed them, and you combine that with Kelly Oubre with the way he's played to start the season, where I think
Yeah.
he's been, one of the best minimum contract signings you'll find. Um, Tyrese Maxey's played very well, right? Joel Embiid, right? Looking, he may be able to get back-to-back MVPs. And
Oh
we might
God,
have
don't take me there. Don't take me there, dude.
three straight guys winning back-to-back
Oh God.
MVPs. Tobias Harris, right? Kind of finding
Yeah.
himself again. I think in a role that I think is better suited for him, where he's playing more at his position. Um, and I mean, I like the look of this team, in terms of what they got right now. Again, I mean, it's just kind of wild because again, we both thought that we liked this for Philly. We still felt like down the line, maybe the end game is to, get a second co-star to pair with Embiid. But as of right now, again, you got a squad that's more than capable of winning a number of games. I mean, Batum, have been out for some personal reasons, but he's come back and he's looked pretty solid for them.
Yeah.
The last few games. Again, they have a lot of versatility and flexibility at a number of different positions now, and again, now you got guys who want to be there and want to be a part of, what's going on. So,
Yeah.
and Nick Nurse, right?
Yeah, and it's like for me, I don't know. Pre Harden trade, I was a little iffy on this team. I was like, they ain't going that far. But now they bolstered it up. I don't think the roster is bare bones at all. Now that we've seen Maxi in action, I'm like, okay, this guy took a serious leap, and I didn't expect it to be that big. He might be MIP already. And then Embiid, like you said, I hate to admit it, but he is playing at that MVP caliber level. It's something to watch. They're number one in the East, which is ridiculous, and I think that definitely deserves a round of applause for them because I think I counted them out way, way too soon.
Right. Yeah, and but that's the thing is, and it's kind of wild because when this trade was initially talked about, our thought process was like, don't trade Harden for scraps because
Right.
they could be in a situation where like Embiid might want out, and it may have felt like when the trade was initially announced that it was for scraps, but again, I think like I said, we both liked it because it just gave Philly some more guys, more depth, especially at positions that they needed. Again, does it ultimately mean that they're now going to make it out of the East? I don't know, but regardless. It looks better. And then with the addition of Nick Nurse, I think, again, now you have, a guy that can go toe to toe with the other coaches,
Yeah.
especially in the East, right? You look at the Bucks and the Celtics, that's your primary competition in the East. And I think, Nick Nurse, I would probably take him over, either Adrian Griffin or Joe Mazzulla. I think
I
it's,
agree.
relatively early, still early for those guys, but just in terms of what Nurse has already accomplished, I think it's, more accomplished than those other guys, but it's
Yeah.
still early. But I really like the look of Philly so far. With Boston, obviously, they were going to come down to earth, at some point. Because no team is going to go 82 and 0, at least right now.
No,
Jalen
no
Brown,
shot.
right? He's kind of struggled in the last few games.
Yeah.
And it does feel like, something just to kind of keep in mind in terms of like it's an adjustment for these guys for sure. Because, again, it's a roster with a lot of new incoming pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Not a whole lot of depth, behind them, which was something that we were concerned about. Um, I still think they're going to be really good. Um, but again, it would probably help to have a little bit more. Because again, I think the starting five is still good, but again, maybe we may have jumped the gun too early on Boston. I still think it's kind of early, but I still think that they're really good.
Yeah.
Again, it just kind of comes down to who are those guys off the bench that can help Boston because you need, I think, ultimately like 8 guys, and they have 5 obviously in the starting 5. Even though again been a little bit of inconsistencies from some of those guys, but still, I think all 5 of those guys you can probably trust.
Yeah.
But then off the bench, who else can you trust, right? Like Horford, didn't have a good game tonight, but I feel like he's got a history overall of being like a guy you can kind of trust in big
He's the
playoff
only one
spots.
for me.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the thing. Who else off the bench, right? Like Peyton Pritchard looked good in preseason, but it hasn't been as impactful so far, in the regular season. And again, maybe it's just a slow start, but then after that, who else? Luke Cornett, Sam Hauser, O'Shea Brissett, Lamar Stevens. Again, like I think, and that's something where it's like that's where the trade deadline comes in, right? Or
Right.
maybe potentially the buyout market where you can add a couple of guys. But for right now, this is the roster you're going to have, so you're going to have to probably kind of work through the fact that you do have kind of a shorthanded roster
Yeah.
or I guess yeah, like a roster that's not very deep.
Yeah, I agree. It's front loaded, in terms of superstar talent and just star talent in general in the starting five. But like you said, once you get past the starting five, it's like, okay, well, we have nobody to go to, and we're probably going to lose games because of that. I'm curious to see, how far it's going to take. This strategy is going to take them in the playoffs, and like you said, deadline is definitely one to watch. I think Boston is going to be a buyer on the deadline. Um, as long as well as some other teams, I think there's a bunch of teams that are definitely going to be buying and selling. So I'm really
Right.
hyped for the deadline, but for right now, I'm not really concerned with them. I think this is just a slump. And, Jalen Brown and Tatum, they're known to have slumps. They just can't have them in the playoffs. That can't happen if they want to win. But in the regular season, you might as well let them get these games out of the way and have their
Right.
slumps when they have them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because that's gonna happen. Because again, they
Yeah.
won their first, I think what 4 games or 4 or 5
I
games
think
or
it was
whatever. So
5. I think they were 5-0 at
yeah,
one point.
yeah, exactly. So now they've lost a couple in a
Yeah.
row, right? Like there was a little bit of regression that I
And
think was
and it's not like
coming.
they got blown out or anything. These were close and competitive games. The last one I think they lost before this one was the overtime one against Minnesota, and
Yeah.
that was a
Yeah,
battle.
this game Philly was up by more than what the final score would
Yes.
suggest, but Boston did battle back to get back in the game.
Yes.
But still, regardless, again, like it's a couple losses that it's nothing to panic about. I think yet.
Exactly.
Just something to think about, right? Because again, Al Horford was minus 23, in a game that was only decided by 3 points. Again, it's just something to think about. It doesn't mean that he's cooked. It doesn't mean he's done.
Right.
Um, but I do think Boston will need to find a little bit more help in that on with that bench unit.
Yeah, I think they'll
Just maybe
find
like
it too.
right, yeah, maybe 1 or 2 more guys, that you can kind of like bring in and see if they can help you a little bit.
Sure.
Um, Now moving on to our last two, games, before we get into our next section, right? So Clippers Nets, right? So Clippers they lost 93 to 100. Um,
Yeah.
0-2, I guess, since Harden's joined the team. Again, it's an early start, right? Where it's like, you're not going to panic after a couple of games.
Right.
Um, but the results, have been kind of weird. Harden in that game, right? 12, 5, and 8, in this game against the Nets, with 5 turnovers, minus 15. Westbrook, 6 of 18, right? 1 of 5 from three, not necessarily amazing. Zubac with 10 and 10, but 5 fouls, minus 11. Kawhi and Paul George, Kawhi, had 17. Paul George at 24. I think, again, that's fine, but it does feel like now the depth feels a little bit more bare bones. Where now you have no pun intended, right? Where it's like Bones Highland, Norman Powell, Terrence Mann, PJ Tucker. And now they have an injury to deal with Mason Plumley, who's gonna
Yeah.
be out, I think, for they said potentially up to 2 months. So,
Yeah.
now Zubac is your only real big out there, and that could potentially be like kind of like a sneaky bad injury. Maybe not, but it is something to think about where it's like, now they don't have the same amount of depth as they had before. And now you're missing a lot, especially at that wing forward spot, where now your only backup forward is PJ Tucker, who's, getting up there in age.
Yeah.
Um, and then like, after that, now Plumlee's out. So again, like I said, it's maybe a little bit too early, to kind of, you know, write anything up, right now. But, overall, it feels like the returns have been a little bit disappointing. But again, I don't think you should necessarily give up after 2 games. But I do think we kind of felt a little bit more optimistic for the trade from the Philly perspective than the
Yeah.
Clippers perspective. Even though I think we thought we understood it from both teams, from both sides, but we liked it more for Philly, I think.
Yeah.
But what have you thought about the Clippers, in terms of what you've seen with this grouping so far?
Yeah, well, I thought they made, I'm not going to say a mistake getting Harden. I was a little bit more on the cautious side of things because I was like, Harden doesn't really fit their identity. I feel like they'd like to go after more of like a two-way player, somebody that has a little bit more grit on the defensive end than Harden. Because like I was thinking they would go after somebody like Drew Holiday back when he was dished out, but that is not the case. So, I don't really know what to say because it's only been 2 games. We have such a small sample size, but everything just seems so discombobulated. And I think that's just going to be growing pains. I think they'll figure it out eventually and probably go on a run where we're like, okay, this is a legit team. Because, they were, I feel like when they did acquire James Harden, people were like, okay, are they better than Phoenix? Are they better than such and such? People started naming off teams that they thought that they were better than on paper, but now it's looking like, I don't know, because I think they've lost 3 straight in a row. So then but then 2 of those were with Harden and one was without. So it seems like,
Right.
they can't really piece it together at all at this point.
Yeah.
And the efficiency is just not there from pretty much any of their guys that are, supposed to be the stars. So I don't know.
Yeah, the first game that they lost was the Lakers game that
Yes.
they lost in OT, and that was post Harden trade, but Harden didn't play. And
Right.
then they lost the last two games. The first one, was that first Harden game with, against the Knicks. And then obviously the other one was this game.
Right.
So yeah. And then from the Brooklyn Nets, 4-4, 500. Obviously, Cam Thomas, unfortunately he got hurt, so he's gonna be
Yeah.
out for a while. And then but they've gotten some good performances out of some of these guys because again, Cam Thomas before his injury was playing very well.
Hmm.
Mikal Bridges got off to a little bit of a slow start, but still in general, I think you got to be fine. Um, with what he's doing. Royce O'Neal, Dorian Finney-Smith, Dinwiddie. Ben Simmons is hurt.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, and I think he had been, relatively fine to start the season. Lonnie Walker off the bench has been really good for them.
Hmm.
Um, you know, again, how do you feel about Brooklyn? I mean, like, they're 4-4. Do you feel like that's a little bit disappointing? Do you feel like that's about where it should be? I
Hmm.
mean,
Yeah.
like, because
I don't know.
I don't think we were super high on Brooklyn,
Mm-mm.
anyways, to the season. So I don't feel like it's too much of a surprise. But at the same time, they are getting some good performances out of some of these.
Yeah, and it's like for me that, like you said, they're 4-4. That's kind of about where I thought they were going to be. I didn't think they were going to be a crazy good team. I didn't think they were going to be, a top seed in the East. But I do think they have the pieces to get there at some point. Maybe down the line, or maybe even later in the season if they do some deadline stuff. Because I mean, you got to think about it. Like Bridges is really good. Cam Thomas is, this seems like his coming out party. And then Dinwiddie can be okay, I guess. And then I don't know. It's just interesting. And then
Cam
I was kind
Thomas,
of banking on Ben Simmons to have a monster well, not a monster, but a comeback season of
right.
sorts. And now
Numbers
that
that
he's
were a
hurt,
little bit closer.
yeah,
Yeah, numbers that were maybe a little bit closer to what it was like post injury. And like the numbers
exactly,
aren't bad, but like, it feels like a little bit of a different stage. Like he's
exactly,
not necessarily been bad, but it just feels like it, it doesn't feel like he's like the star version of Simmons.
right,
It feels like it's more like utility guy,
yeah, he's not the same. I can
which is
tell you
better
that.
than yeah, which is better than, what it was last year,
Right,
but it still feels like, you're wishing that you got a little bit more.
exactly,
But,
but yeah.
hopefully maybe some Nets fans will let us know.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like, they're probably expecting more from Bridges. I think that's probably what's going on. And then,
Right.
Thomas being hurt does not help. So I don't know. I feel
Right.
like this is kind of rough. And then Claxton, I think, is hurt as well. So
Yeah, it's just a lot of injuries. I think that's
yeah,
kind of the other thing, that I hadn't necessarily mentioned yet, but I do want to be fair to that. Like, and again, there's been a ton of injuries around the league, so it's like there's not a whole lot you can say, for a lot of these, because again, like with the Nets, yeah, no Claxton, no Cam Johnson. Those are two starters, who are really good.
exactly.
That do a lot for this team in terms of what it allows them to do on both ends of the floor. Simmons is out and he was starting, right? That's so you're talking about like three starters basically. Um, that are all solid players, right? And now you're without Cam Thomas, who kind of stepped in, now to being a starter with some of these guys out, and now he's hurt. So
Yeah,
that's injuries are really brutal. It seems like for a number of teams, and for the Nets, it seems like it's definitely killed some of their mojo. Because I feel like there may be a better version of this team than like 500, but at the same time, I still don't feel like the ceiling
right,
as
right, right.
currently constructed is like super high.
Yeah,
Which is what we thought going into the season.
exactly.
Um, yeah, and then just to kind of finish off the Clippers thing, I guess, the thing with them is I do wonder if that's the starting five they're going to continue to go with because it just feels like there's something missing in that starting five.
Someone's got to go.
Which yeah, which is like the concern that I had because it's like you don't necessarily have a dirty work guy. I mean, I guess you have Zubat, but that's about it, and that's not going to work in every matchup. Just because there's some matchups where he might get ran off the floor. And
Exactly.
then with the two guards, right? Like then the issue there is that like, well, if one of them has the ball more, then the other guy has to play off the ball more, and both of those guys prefer playing on the ball. But they're also not great defensively either. And like some of their defensive issues are like the same type of issues where like they're not going to get overpowered or bullied in matchups, right? Because they're both, big, strong, physical guys for their positions. But like for Westbrook, usually it's like a lack of attention, like
Yes.
where he is a guy off the ball.
Hmm.
And then for Harden, it's like a lack of effort, where it's like he
Yeah,
just doesn't
it's
try.
lazy.
Like you know what I mean? Like yeah, and like that's the issue there. And I feel like then that means Kawhi and Paul George have to clean up more defensively. But now like Kawhi's a power forward, and like I don't know about that. I mean, I could be wrong because
Yeah,
because again, it's 2 games, which is a very small sample size.
sure.
In a season that's only been 7 games long, right? So it's like it's not panic time yet, but I feel like it's something where it's like keep an eye on maybe one of those other guys, contracts that they have where maybe they may look to move one of those guys because
Hmm.
I just feel like it's still like at this point now it's way too many guards because
Yeah,
you still have Bones, Highland, Terrence Mann, and Norman Powell all in that group, and like Highland's not much of a defender,
nope,
Norman Powell's not much of a
nope,
defender, and then like Terrence Mann's a solid defender, which is
absolutely.
fine, but then it's like then you're flanked by PJ Tucker at the four, who's getting pretty old at this point.
And
So,
your
and again,
backup
I
big
like
is hurt,
Tucker.
so
Right, and yeah, exactly. And now your backup big man is hurt, so now you have to play even smaller. Um, so I don't know. Like I said, it's still early. But again, I still feel like that this trade will, in the long run, work out better for Philly. But
yeah,
maybe
me
I'm
too.
wrong.
I agree with you.
Yeah. And then now we'll touch in our last game get to before we go into our next segment, and that's this Lakers Rockets game where the Rockets are now 4-3. This was a team right where I'm not sure we had like a whole lot of expectations for them.
I thought they were going to be
I thought
better than a
yeah,
lot of people did. I thought they were going to
right.
be
I think we
decent.
thought they were going to be better, but I don't think we looked at them as like a possible playoff team. And again,
No,
it's
no, no.
still early, but they have won 3 in a row. Two blowout wins against the Kings and another blowout win against the Lakers. In fairness, like all three of those games, like with the Kings, like I don't think De'Aaron Fox has played.
Right.
Which got hurt in their matchup against the Lakers, and he hasn't played since then.
Yeah.
And the Kings kind of struggled with him out, which makes sense, right? He's one of their best players.
Yep.
But maybe their best player. Depending on who you ask. Um, but you look at the Rockets box score, very balanced. Contributions from a lot of different guys. Jalen Green, this was a guy, where we talked about him, being in a slump and not playing very well, and it seemed like he snapped out of it.
Yeah. He must have saw the
Yeah,
podcast. He went off.
yeah, yeah, exactly. 28, 7, and 6. Or excuse me, 28 and 7.
Yeah.
With 3 assists, a steal, 11 of 15 from the field, 5 of 6 from three. He was shooting, I think, under 40% from the field.
Yeah.
Fred VanVleet, 2 of 9, but still 10 assists. I think you'll take that. Alperen Şengün with 19, 7, and 4. Playing really well.
Hmm.
Dylan Brooks, right? Obviously, he kind of, made a statement before the game started. Um, you know, 5 points, 4 rebounds, got into foul trouble. So, didn't really do a whole lot. Jabari Smith Jr., 12.6 rebounds. Um, Jeff Green, right, with 9.6 rebounds.
Hmm.
Jay Sean Tate, 14. And then you look at the Lakers box score, just 94 points. Kind of like a semi-skeleton crew out there. No AD, which was kind of intriguing, right? He played in that Heat game, got hurt, which we hadn't talked about because
Yeah.
at that point, we hadn't recorded yet.
Right.
Because that was a non-recording day. So there was a lot of talk about, whether or not he would come back. He said he would come back and he didn't come back. Um, you know, and like that's kind of been the thing, like with this group is again, they're 3-5, 0-5 on the road. A boatload of injuries to begin the season. And that's pretty brutal because I mean,
Yeah.
again, like, some of these guys you're relying on, to help contribute, like, Anthony Davis, right? He's your best defensive guy, the guy that kind of, cleans up a lot of the stuff. And he's not there. Rui finally comes back. He had missed several games with a concussion, which I didn't, initially know he had.
I didn't
Because
know that
I
either.
think when he first got hurt, it was labeled an eye contusion, and now
Okay.
it's now it's and then it was labeled a concussion.
Okay.
Um, still no Gabe Vincent, still no Vanderbilt, but again, 3-5, and the last couple of games, it feels like the effort has also been very bad. We're like, just from opening tip, it just feels like guys like just don't care. I understand it's still kind of a shorthanded group, but just kind of a weird vibe going on right now. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. I think the Lakers have probably been one of the teams that's been very underwhelming to me. I thought they would be off to a stronger start. And I don't know if that's based on, the play, the scheme. I don't know, the new personnel. It seems like they haven't really been able to fit the new guys in all that great. And then Reeves not playing, up to the standard that he was playing last year in the playoffs and then also in the World Cup. That's, I think, definitely been a factor too. I haven't
Yeah.
watched too many Lakers games, but from the ones that I've watched, I've been very disappointed. Like I said, sitting at 3-5, I would have expected them to be a little bit better than this. I didn't expect Houston to be above them, although it has been 7, 8 games for most of the league. So I do understand that it is very early, and I think the Lakers are one of those teams that will definitely bounce back, especially when they're fully healthy and they do figure it out. Because I think once this team, figures it out and once they're on, they're pretty much on until they meet an unstoppable, force or something like that.
Yeah, because I think that's the main thing is that, it's tough to have, all these guys out. Because the thing is that there's been a lot of injuries around the league, and that's kind of been
Yeah.
a key thing that we talked about, where we've just mentioned guy after guy for a number of teams just
Yep.
being out. And the thing, that we liked about this team was the fact that, like, hey, you have real depth, around LeBron, particularly guys that play the same position. So, like, let's say if he's out or if he's off the floor, you can survive. But, it's kind of been the story where, like, when he's on the floor, they've been a net positive, and when he's off the
Yeah.
floor, been really awful, even with AD, playing well, because that's the thing. Both guys have played well,
Yeah.
and up until AD injury, both guys were healthy. Um, but it hasn't worked. The starting five, it was kind of interesting where, Torian Prince has been the starter, and I think, going into the season, I was under the expectation that Rui was going to start because of the new contract, but
Right.
I personally preferred Vanderbilt only because of the defense.
Sure.
And then in the preseason, right, Vanderbilt was out, so they had to start Prince. They started Rui in the first game, and it didn't mesh. And then so then they put in Prince, and the shooting was there, but it seems like the offense like still hasn't really clicked even with those guys out there. And that's where I think like you probably like once guys come back, you're probably going to need to change that starting five.
Yeah.
Um, and then again, like eventually you're going to have to determine like which guys are going to be out of the rotation because again, like Colin Castleton, who's a two-way guy, right? He comes in the first quarter, and that's a G League guy, right?
Right.
That's not a guy that can be playing actual minutes. Max Christie and Cam Reddish, they've been like big, they've been playing a lot because these guys are out, and like they probably wouldn't play a whole lot
Right.
if if most of these guys were back. Like Cam Reddish, closed. Has not only started a lot of games but also closed, right? And there have been games where his defense has been good, but his offense has been rough. And even with Christie, his offense hasn't been great either.
Sure.
Again, Gabe Vincent's been out. That's your best guard defender. So that's kind of the thing is that like I would like to see 75% of the guys back, to kind of gauge like what I think about it. Because I don't think it's necessarily panic time yet.
No, no, no.
I think it definitely has been a disappointing start, even with kind of one of the tougher schedules where you played a lot of decent teams. I think you would have thought it would have been a better start. But again, I would like to wait and see, what happens when these guys come back, and then they've kind of figured out, like, hey, this is where this guy's supposed to play. This is where this guy's supposed to be. Because,
Right.
that's the other thing, like, because you mentioned it with Reeves, he's really struggled, to begin the season, right? Like, him and D'Lo have kind of taken turns,
Yeah.
of like it just seems like it hasn't worked. And then like if those guys aren't playing good on offense, then that's where things kind of fall apart. So I think that's the main thing is that, and I think either way, my thought process always was like, by the time the trade deadline rolls around, you use one of those, a couple of those contracts and maybe like parlay that into something else. And maybe you won't have to, but either way, like I said, it's definitely a disappointing start. But like I said, I would like to see, as with some of these other teams, I would like to see, again, maybe 70% of the team healthy. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like as opposed to like one guy coming back, like Rui coming back and then AD being out, or like, other guys, who shouldn't really be playing a whole lot,
Right.
playing. Like that's the main thing. So, not panic time necessarily yet, but not the start you would have wanted to see.
Yeah, and the Braunless minutes are really hard to watch with this team. I'm not
Right.
gonna
And
lie.
that's the other thing is
That's the
that,
hard
that's
part.
the right, and that's the other concern. This game it wasn't a problem because they didn't play anybody in the fourth, but
Right.
both those guys have played heavy minutes
Yeah.
to begin the season because again, all the guys that are out happen to be at the positions they play, right? Like Rui, Torian Prince was out for a few games, Vanderbilt, Jackson Hayes, right? Like all those guys play the positions that LeBron and AD play. And that's rough because again, like, those guys, the more minutes they play, the more at risk they might be for injury. And AD's already out due to injury, and we don't know, how long he'll be out. I think he's questionable for the next game, but either way, that's kind of the rough part, and that's kind of the thing that you have to hope for is that those guys can stay healthy. It's just
Right.
kind of wild how those guys, were able to stay healthy during the early part of the season, but it's been everybody else around them that's been hurt, given the fact that those guys, for the most part, have missed a lot of time the last few seasons.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, so I think now, again, we don't need to go over every game because we've gone over a lot. I think now we're gonna kind of get into just another segment where, some of the surprises so far. Like semi hot takey, but not like too extreme. Again, it's based off of what we've seen so far, and again, some of these things could change. Some of these things may be legit. But I'll let you kind of go first.
Yeah.
And you take it from here and kind of share your thoughts.
Yeah, so my first surprise has definitely been the Philadelphia 76ers. Them starting at 6-1 is crazy because I thought they were going to be, one of the more middle of the pack teams where it's like, okay, they could be a 4th seed. I would have switched, maybe Milwaukee and Philadelphia where they kind of stand cuz Milwaukee's 5-3 and they haven't really played up to par, I don't think, but Philly has exceeded my expectations, if we look at their roster, now it's James Harden less, but at the same time they still look really, really good. Like it's honestly scary because they do have all the depth in the pieces that they did acquire, and then obviously Tyrese Maxey has been hooping on another level. We kind of talked about this earlier. Kelly Oubre, and then obviously Joel Embiid has been balling out. But I think this really just took me by surprise because I didn't think they were gonna do this well. I don't know. I'm kind of at a loss for words because I do understand the reason why, in bringing in a new coach, a new system, new personnel, and then the internal leaps as well. But it is surprising because I would have thought that, teams like Boston, Milwaukee, and some others would have been, off to a, more hot start. But it is really intriguing to me.
Yeah, and that's kind of the intriguing thing because again, like Harden, even before the Harden trade, right? Like Philadelphia was looking, pretty solid. Where like they lost that Bucks game, but it was very competitive.
Sure.
Despite not having Harden, and despite missing some other guys, they didn't have any of the guys they just brought in. So and that's kind of the thing where it's like, again, it helps to have guys, play positions, that you didn't have, and they didn't have that before, and now they have it. It just kind of comes down to again, come playoff time, what do we see? Because that's the thing where like, Philly had a stretch last year where they looked very good.
Yeah.
Um, I think during the latter part of the year, they had either the best record in the NBA or pretty close to it. And then ultimately they ended up falling short in the playoffs again. And that's kind of the thing, right? Where it's like, again, last year you look at Harden and Embiid, and both of those guys had pretty solid regular seasons, or well, in Embiid's case, he won MVP. And then
Sure.
in the playoffs, right, they took a step back. Um, and so once you get to the playoffs again, what do you see, right, from those guys, right? Because again, like, do you see, like a little bit of a similar drop off with Embiid? Or maybe, now that you have a guy like a Nick Nurse, maybe he schemes a little bit better, and then
Sure.
maybe Embiid's, plays close to this what we normally see in the regular season. I'm not sure. But either way, I think if you're Philly, you gotta be pretty pleased so far. Because I think,
Exactly.
you know, again, like I think a lot of Philly fans were pretty pissed off, from the ending of last season, up through the entire offseason. And now
Yeah.
I think they have at least something to be relatively happy about. Again, we'll see how far it goes. But yeah, I think that's definitely been a surprise because I think we were kind of low on Philly to start the
Extremely.
season.
I was
Uh,
extremely low on them.
yeah, like I don't think I was quite as low on you, but I was definitely not high
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
them,
Yeah.
for sure. So, but like I liked, and again, that was like, even after the Ubre thing, I liked it better, but like still,
Yeah.
um, either way, yeah, I think that's definitely been like, if not number one, like it's got to be up there because I
Yeah.
think again, 6-1 is really good. Now, again, we'll see if they can keep it up, but again, we're basing this off of the first stretch of the season.
Yeah.
It's very early, but still, you got
And
to
I'm
be really
assuming
pleased.
it's a surprise for you too.
Yeah, it actually
Yeah.
was.
Yeah. I bet. Yeah.
One on my list, and that's the thing. We haven't shared these ahead of
Yeah.
time, so we may have some, similar ones, and that's definitely one, that I think we both shared. Because
Yeah.
again, how could you not? I mean, like,
Yeah, it's ridiculous because I'm telling you, I don't think any real like basketball watcher was like, okay, after everything that happened in this offseason with Dame going to Milwaukee and then all the moves that the Celtics made and then just all the internal development talks that we heard from certain organizations, the hype around Orlando, you're just like, okay, well, we haven't heard Jack Diddley squat from Philly except for Harden wants out. Okay. It's like, okay, well, they're doomed for, I don't know, disaster, but that has not been the case. They've been the strongest team in the East.
mine, and this may be a little hot takey. Maybe
Okay.
it's not. It feels like Denver might be better this year than they were last year.
Ooh, I hadn't even thought of that one. That's a good one.
Yeah, like
I
I'm
like
not
that.
sure,
Okay.
right? But it's like they're 8-1.
Right.
Aside from a couple games here and there, right? Like they've been beating most of their teams, most of their matchups pretty handedly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, all their main guys look great. A couple of those guys look like they may be a little bit better, like I mentioned, Michael Porter Jr.
Sure.
Even some of the things Aaron Gordon's doing. The young guys, they've had some games where they've been pretty productive, right? Like Strother, is a guy that has played, I think, in some stretches pretty well.
Yeah.
Um, Reggie Jackson, being a lot better, I think, this year so far than he was last year for Denver. That
Yep.
helps as well because it gives you a little bit more depth at the point guard spot, for, Jamal Murray being out, which again, now he's out. And he's been and again, Reggie Jackson is going to have to, take on, more of a responsibility. And with that combination of all those things, because now you have a backup point guard that again, can you trust down the line? Maybe I don't know.
Right.
He's kind of an up and down guy, but we'll see. It looks like he's been better. Um, and again, playing alongside a guy like Jokic, I think will help. And if those young guys continue to play well, they could be better than last year. I
Yeah.
mean, again, it may be an early thing, and again, like it was a competitive game last night, for sure, and we'll see what it looks like when both teams, are full or whole or whatever. But that's what it feels like right now.
Yeah, I agree. And, I hadn't even really thought of it like that because I was coming into this season with the impression that they were going to back to back it just because I thought that that I just felt like that's how it was going to go. But, so far this season, it seems like they've been like really the only team that has figured it out completely in the West. I feel like because, looking in the East, it's a little bit of a different story. But in the West, this is the team that I'm so confident with just because, they do have Jokic. I feel like nobody really understands how on earth they're going to stop him, how they're going to slow him down. Because, like we said earlier in this podcast, he had a bad game, by quote unquote
Yeah,
bad game standards.
yeah,
Yeah. But then
yeah.
you look at the stats and it's like, okay, clearly it wasn't that bad of a game because he had, a decent amount of points. He had the rebounds. He just missed a bunch of threes and they barely won. That's pretty much the only reason why it looked like that. So I am curious, to see what the recipe for success, for other teams is going to be once they do end up facing this team in the playoffs, because it's a guarantee that this team is going far in the playoffs. So I agree wholeheartedly, and I just hadn't thought of it like that. For them to be a surprise that they are pretty much better than what they were last year. I think that's a great take because they seem to be playing with more chemistry. I don't know. It seems like they just haven't figured it out. Like they just have it figured out. Simple as that. And then for my surprise, this one's not even really a team. This is a player. Oddly enough, we pretty much mentioned like a lot of my surprises like in this episode, but it's Cam Thomas. This guy's taken me by surprise a lot. I know he was a pure scorer. I knew that, him coming out of college. I knew all that stuff. We saw it last year. I think he put up back-to-back 40-point games last year. But, for him to come out and be scoring, 27 points per game, with fairly limited opportunities initially, but then later down the line due to injury, he did eventually get into the starting lineup. The scoring potential is there, and I think he has made a case so far for MIP. But with him being out and injured, we'll see how long that lasts. But it seems like he's added to his bag, and it's really been fun to watch. And it took me by surprise to see him putting up these kinds of stats. I know, the lack of defense, the shooting percentage. There's questions about the efficiency and the numbers, but regardless, 27 points is 27 points per game from a guy that's not, he wasn't picked very high. 27th pick round one. It's not like this guy was coming out of college being a superstar. But I think he does have that superstar quote unquote potential. I think it just depends on the system and, who's healthy and who's not.
Yeah, this is definitely a guy, who's kind of had sort of an up and down type of narrative, right? Because
Hmm.
like when he first was drafted, right, he was kind of posed as like a decent scorer,
Sure.
and he showed some flashes, in his summer league games and in his preseason games, but he just wasn't like a big part of the Nets rotation outside of like when guys got hurt.
Right.
But now it seems like his scoring has continued to to get even better because, like you said, obviously you got questions and concerns about the defense, but the offense has been really good. It's been efficient. It's been very impactful in terms of like, some of those games they don't win without, what he's been able to do.
Exactly.
Um, and again, like, even in some of the games they lost, I mean, like, again, like he wasn't the reason they lost. Like, like say they lost to the Bucks, in a close game, he had 45. I don't think they lost because he was getting cooked on defense.
Right.
Um, but either way, yeah, I think that's definitely like a huge surprise this season because again, like I already knew he was a solid player. I mean, again, it's a small sample size, so we'll see what happens when he comes back from injury. But yeah, like almost 30 a game, from anybody on the Brooklyn Nets would have been a pretty big surprise to me because I don't really look at them as a team that would have anybody that would be like, a 25,
Exactly.
plus point score. Even like Mikal Bridges, who I like, I feel like, much more than like 20, he would probably, kind of cap out in terms of his ceiling, especially
Right.
because they have other guys. But like,
Yeah.
27, 28 a game, I think
Yeah,
that's
it's pretty
pretty,
wild. Sitting at
yeah,
500 too. So it's not like they're playing losing basketball completely.
yeah. But like either way, yeah, you got to be pretty pleased with that.
Yeah.
Again, he's a relatively, undersized guy at 6'3", but he's kind of a biggish 6'3",
Yeah.
right? So he's not like, like a complete twig or anything. So he can
Yeah.
kind of get,
Yeah.
physical. He's a decent athlete. So I mean,
Sure.
again, I think he's been really good. So
Yeah.
I think that's definitely a big surprise,
Yeah.
for sure. I think my next surprise, and this is also a player, and we've already kind of, talked about him,
Yeah.
at times. So, I don't think this is too much of a surprise, right? It's Eric Lively. Now
Okay.
obviously he's, a few games due to, I think an illness or whatever. But, just the fact that like as a rookie, right, he's come in, and he's putting up, pretty good numbers, right? 9 points, 8 rebounds, 78% from the field.
Yeah.
Um,
That's pretty wild.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
a miss.
exactly. Yeah, a block a game, running the floor, creating second chance opportunities, doing everything Dallas could ask for, from their starting big. And he's, outside of, obviously like, their main guys like Luca or whatever, he's one of the biggest reasons why Dallas, is sitting at, 6-2 or whatever.
Sure.
Like he's been really impactful. From a defensive standpoint, from a rebounding standpoint, again, he's really helped, kind of shore up some of their issues. Again, like, is he a complete antidote? Not necessarily, but just to come in, as a 19-year-old rookie or whatever, to a team, again, that we didn't expect to be like a championship team, but like, a team that we thought would be better and we liked that pick. But I think he's even been more impactful than I think we would have expected. And,
Yeah.
again, I don't think it's much of a shocker that, they've struggled a little bit more in the defensive end in the last few games that he's been out. And he's kind of turned into a guy where like they need him out there, right? Because
Yeah.
then it's like he's not out there, then your starting center, you're either going back to Dwight Powell, or you're going to like a Maxi Kleba, and like those guys are okay, but I think they're more suited as backups. I just, again, I don't feel like they're starters. We've seen Dwight Powell be the starting center for Dallas for
11
a little.
years. I'm pretty
Yeah,
sure
I
it's
know,
been
like
11 years, which is
yeah, like
ridiculous.
even when Porzingis was there at times, they would start both of them together. So I
Right.
mean, just in general, like that's kind of where that's been a big surprise because I thought he'd be, fine, but like I wouldn't have expected him to already step in and be their starting center and be a guy where they have to have him pretty much in order to be, like a good team.
Yeah. Back when they drafted him, I had thought that they should start him just because I thought, the potential upside was definitely there, especially with him being one of the few centers in this draft. I think this draft had very few centers. I think there were only about 3 or 4, maybe, but I could be missing a few. But in general, I've been very impressed with him as well. I'd say more so impressed than surprised, but I do understand what you're talking about because he has put up some really good numbers and he outshined Wemby, um, in their matchup. So that was really cool to watch. Um, but overall, I think it's kind of funny because my next surprise is actually directly related to that because it is Dallas. I think Dallas in general has taken me by surprise because this wasn't a
Right.
team where we looked at their offseason and was like, okay, yeah, they're going to be a contender. We thought it was going to be like, okay, yeah, they're going to be better than last year, but they're still probably going to be up and down due to the personnel that they do have. But I think Derek Lively has been a crazy part of that because he does bring a certain, I feel like, vibe of basketball that you don't really see too often anymore, especially on a team like Dallas where they're so offensively talented. But then, if you look at their defense, it's like, okay, they don't really have a lot of defenders because they need, they have a lot of guys that are ISO basketball gods, pretty much. Luca, Kyrie. I could go on and on. Jaden Hardy. There's just a lot of scorers on this team, but they don't have that defender. But then you pick up Lively, and it's like, okay, this switches the vibe totally. So I think, they do have a chance. I think to go pretty far in the playoffs if they keep this play up. I think guys need to stay healthy, of course. I think Kyrie can't afford to miss too much time, and Luca definitely can't because I think he's also on a case for MVP right now. So I feel like Dallas has surprised me and probably a bunch of other people.
I mean, that clearly, yeah, they've definitely been a surprise, for both of us because we basically had, like you said, a little bit different versions
Sure.
of Dallas, in terms of like, you had the whole team and I had Lively. But yeah, because again, I think we thought they would be better. But then we saw them in the preseason, and they looked pretty bad. Now we
Right.
did add some context in terms of you had a number of guys out, but even like with some of those guys there, it didn't really look that great.
Right.
Um, but regardless, yeah, they've been a lot better, to start off the season, and like that's kind of the main thing is that
Yeah.
like again 6-2 again it's early. So we'll see if they can keep it up, and again that's even with a guy like a Kyrie missing time and not also really playing that well. You know what I mean? Because
Exactly.
like we hadn't really talked about it because you mentioned and then like in fairness, some of that could be that he's missed some time due to an
True.
injury, but like you look at his numbers, um, and I think he had a little bit of a bounce back game a couple games ago, but still like his he's averaging 20 and 7, which doesn't sound bad, but like 43 from the field, 28 from three. That's not typically what you would expect in terms of efficiency from him, right? Like
Sure.
for his career, 47 from the field, 39 from three. So and I feel like again, like if he can get his efficiency up, it could probably help Dallas look a little bit better, right? Because then the offense would be a little bit smoother. But regardless, um, yeah, they've definitely been, a big surprise for me. I
Yeah.
guess the question is like, have which one is more of a surprise to you? I guess Philly or Dallas? I guess
Ooh.
Philly because they
Probably
were your
Philly. Yeah.
first, I guess would be more,
Yeah.
but like, which one did you expect to be a worse team going into the season?
I want to say Philly, and I think I'm gonna stick with Philly because I really was feeling, that Dallas did have something cooking. I think I felt more optimistic about Dallas than I did Philly. I felt very negatively about Philly due to the fact that all of the movement in the East was ridiculous, and they kind of were just sitting there with Harden drama, and they weren't really making any waves. And then them talking to the Clippers didn't help their case at the time because I didn't know what the package was going to be. I didn't think the Clippers were going to, give up Terrence Mann, which they didn't, thank God. But they
Mm.
did give up their other role players, and I think that's significantly hurting them. But I think at the time I'm more right now I'm more surprised at Philly for sure because I think their success has been on a different level because I didn't expect a lot of the stuff that's been going well for them to actually be going well.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah.
Um, I guess the next one, and it's kind of like in a similar vein, where
Okay.
it's like feel like it's like a huge it may not be like a huge surprise, but like it's a little bit in terms of how it looks.
Hmm.
And I feel like that is the Oklahoma City Thunder, right? Where
Okay.
they are, 5-3. And again, they had a couple of games, right, where Shea didn't play, and maybe they win those games if he had played, so they could have a potentially better record.
Sure.
Um, they look really good, I think.
I agree.
And again, we already knew going in where like they have a lot of talent. Obviously, even outside of Shea Gilgeous-Alexander, who's played very well. Again, Jalen Williams, Lou Dort, Josh Giddey, who's been in a slump, but Chet Holmgren, right? That's also the other big
Yeah.
piece. Which may be like even like the big. I don't know if that would be a bigger surprise, but like just in terms of the way he's played, I feel like has been even better than I think you would have thought.
Yeah.
In his first year, right, 17 points, 8 rebounds, 2.5 blocks a game. 58% from the field and 56% from three.
It's
I don't
crazy.
I don't think that's necessarily quite as sustainable.
Sure.
But regardless, you can see he looks, ready. Like in
Yeah,
terms
he
of he
looks the
looks
part.
ready, he's
Yeah.
impactful, he's productive. Like he looks like he's gonna be really good, and he already is really good.
Yeah.
In his first year to get that version of Chet Holmgren, right, as opposed to like whatever you would have gotten last year. That's a really good development for Oklahoma City. That makes Oklahoma City a lot more difficult of a team to handle because now you
Yeah.
have like a legitimate big who can do a lot of different things out there, right? He can shoot, he can defend, he can run the floor. Um, he can move his feet, defensively. I mean, like he can do a lot of different things. And like Oklahoma City has a number of players like that at other positions, right? And then you look at Cason Wallace, right, where he's a rookie and he's coming in and he already looks very productive for them.
Sure.
You have a couple other guys, right? Like an Usman Jang, looks relatively solid for them, right? Like Lou Dort. Josh Giddey's been kind of the main one that's in a slump.
Yeah.
We'll see, if he can kind of snap out of it going forward. But regardless, like, they look really good and they might be a little better than what I kind of thought they were going to be because I
Yeah.
thought they would definitely be better. But, but I thought it might be like, oh, they might be like, instead of like 9-10, maybe like 7-8, but they could be
Sure.
like a top five seed in the Western
Yeah.
Conference because especially for the regular season, they're built to win like a ton of regular season games.
Yeah, and they're sitting at 5 right now. They're 5-3, and it's like, for me, I would
Right.
have expected them to be closer to, like, that 7 range. I would have expected Phoenix to be where OKC is right now, and it's like, okay, I mean, that's really cool, but, like, goodness gracious, the play has been amazing. I feel like the record doesn't really speak for itself. I feel like they could have had an even better record. They could be, sitting where Dallas is sitting, who knows? Um, but overall, I've been very impressed and surprised by the play. I knew that we were both high on the team, but I didn't expect the leap to be taken this early. I thought the leap was going to be, maybe mid-season. I thought they were going to have a strong mid-season push, and then closer to the end of the season where it's like, okay, this is a legit playoff team. But we're seeing that, strong and early, and Shea has been hooping on a whole different level, accompanied with Chet, obviously. So love to see it in general. And then for my next one, I think a lot of casuals are probably gonna hate me for this, but then I'll probably a lot of hardcore fans are gonna be like, okay, I could see why that makes sense. But it's Dylan Brooks. I think his
Yep.
play has been interesting,
Yeah.
surprising. I'll say that. I think his role has gotten a little bit larger, I think, than it was in Memphis. He's averaging around 14.7 points per game, 4.5 rebounds, 2 assists.
That's down from what it was because, in this last game against the Lakers, he didn't play very well offensively.
Exactly. But the real kicker is, he's shooting almost 57% from the field. And that's from an extension, from being a crazy player on Team Canada. In Team Canada, he looked really good. So, the red hot shooting has been carried over from Canada to Houston. And I feel like Memphis may have messed up by dishing him out. I do understand, the narrative and the trash talk and just talking out of the mouth. But at the end of the day, the guy can ball and he can play a little bit of defense here and there. So I mean, I can't really hate it, but it has been a surprise to me because I'm like, dang, I didn't expect him to actually flourish in this new role.
I mean, I never thought that he was a bad player. I was a little
Me
bit
neither.
surprised in terms of the contract, but I think, at the time when we talked about it, I thought like, hey, like it's a 4-year deal, but it goes down each year. And we'll see, where that goes.
Right.
But, I do think like, like a lot of people made the China jokes and whatnot, but like he's not a bad NBA player, right?
Not
Like
at all.
obviously that will irk a lot of people, but he has like, real talent. And he's showing that I think for Houston definitely this season. I mean, like they've won 4 in a row, and he's been a big part, of most of those, 4 wins, right? I mean,
Yeah.
again, like you talked about the efficiency again. Is that going to stay? Probably
Probably
not.
not.
Yeah, well, actually, it won't, right? Because
It's already going down.
yeah, 57 from the field, yeah, 54%. I think he was like at 60%,
Yes.
before the Laker game. But either way, like he's a streaky guy, but it does feel like it does feel like the signing has worked out very well for Houston.
Yeah.
And again, like, they've won 4 in a row and, some of those wins, yeah, they were able to take advantage of shorthanded teams, but, the way that you know, get a good record in the NBA is you have to start off by beating the teams you're supposed to beat.
It's a part of
So
the
if you're
game.
going in and you're going up against a shorthanded team, you got in those games because if you don't, right, then there's less room for error, when you go up against, a fully healthy team,
Yep.
right? Like you can sustain a loss to like Golden State, or somebody like that who's a really good team, when you can beat, go into Sacramento, win back to back games. You have an opportunity with De'Aaron Fox out to win both those games. You go into LA, you have an opportunity to win with AD and a bunch of other guys out. And,
Right.
he's been a big part of that. And Ime Udoka, right? That's the other thing, right? Where it's kind of like that's, a factor where he's a really good coach. We saw it in Boston and he's done some stuff, in Houston in terms of turning some stuff around. They had a couple other guys get off to slow starts. Like we mentioned, Jalen Green had gotten off to a slow start. Jabari Smith Jr. got off to a slow start to begin the season, right? Where it was more so like the vet guys, came in kind of ready. Whereas the
Sure.
young guys seemed like they started off kind of slow. Obviously Amon Thompson, he got hurt
Right.
with I think
Forgot about
grade
that.
2 ankle sprain, right? So he's going to be out for a while. But either way, they look better. It's a small sample size, so I don't know how it will pan out, once we get to like 30, 40 games in.
Right.
But either way, I think it feels like, Memphis might be missing Dylan Brooks a little bit. Again, they are
Yeah.
very short-handed as well. So, that plays a factor. But, they might have messed up. I mean,
Yeah.
it may be a little early to say, but I don't know. Like, you look at Memphis and they've really been struggling. And again, like, does Dylan Brooks, fix their 1-7 start or whatever? like maybe. I mean, like they're like probably not just because of the other personnel. Like you're without your best player, but either
Right.
way, like I mean, again, like Memphis just looks very small right now. Like even with Biombo out there, like it just looks like a very small team.
You can see the
And
difference.
Dylan
It's not
Brooks,
the same.
yeah, you can see the difference. But again, we'll see, and maybe it's like he probably just wouldn't have gotten that opportunity in Memphis, just given the personnel. But in
Right.
Houston, right, where it's a little bit different because you don't have the same like pecking order, right? Like there's no Ja Morant, in Houston, like whereas like in Memphis, right, you have a Ja, right? You have a guy who's like a superstar, whatever you want to call him,
Yeah.
right? You don't have that in Houston, so you have way more opportunities to take advantage of stuff.
Exactly.
I mean, taking full advantage of it. So you got to give him a lot of credit because
Yeah,
he's
he's
been
been
good
hooping.
and his play has been one of the reasons for why Houston has been good. So I think Houston should be very happy with how things have started out because
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, ourselves included, right, we're not super high on what Houston did. We still thought they would be better.
Right.
There's still a long way to go to see if they will make the playoffs. But either way, it feels like there is something there in terms of there definitely feels like a little bit of a shift in terms of the culture and the accountability. And I think,
Absolutely.
guys like Fred Van Vliet and Dylan Brooks, however you feel about Dylan Brooks personally, right? It seems like they've helped with that.
Yeah, even Fred VanVleet, like you were saying, he made the shooting may not be, all that, it may be a little bit down, and that's kind of what comes with him. But the defense and the playmaking effort is for sure there. So shout out both those guys.
I mean, yeah, and then this next one, this one is a little bit more of a negative one, kind of like
Okay.
the one you had mentioned before, and this one is Scoot Henderson. I think this one
Ooh,
is
yeah,
definitely
yeah,
a surprise for me, personally, just because again, now I think going in, I think we both felt that like Brandon Miller would probably come out and be better, like to start. You know what I
yes,
mean? Like, even though I still thought that, like, okay, Charlotte, you should take Scoot two on overall, I still felt like Brandon Miller will come in and look more ready.
I agree.
Just because, again, I just think in terms of the skill set and even like defensively, Miller's looked pretty solid at times. But for Scoot, like the start's been really rough. I mean, again, now he's hurt, so he hasn't played in a little bit, but 8 point, just under 9 points a game, just under 5 assists, half a steal, um, 9% from three,
Yeah,
35% from the field.
it's
Four
bad.
fouls, four turnovers a game through 5 games. Again, that's a very small sample size, but it's definitely been a real struggle, for him out there. And again, like again, like in terms of the environment, in terms of everything around them, like, like it's not insane in the sense of like, there's no like wild cards out there, but it is kind of a strange team where you have a lot of guards, that also kind of like to have the ball in their hands as well. So like the role is very strange, I think. But either way, I still thought he would start off better. It's a very small sample size. The defense looks horrible.
Yeah, it's bad.
And like in fairness, a rookie point guard coming in, like you don't expect too many guys to come in and be like great defensively,
Sure.
especially like if they're smaller, even though
Yes.
he's, a very strong, sturdy guy, he's still like 6'2",
Yeah.
6'3", whatever. But I definitely thought he'd be a little better to start off the season. Like this has been pretty rough. And again, it can get better.
Yeah.
Like I don't think he's doomed like to fail or like
No,
that,
no, no.
or we sound the bust alarm or anything like that. But I don't know. I'm a little bit disappointed in how he started off so far. But again, like if you're Portland, maybe you're okay with it because then that means you will lose more games, when
Yeah,
he's out there.
and it's
He's
like,
been kind of a
yeah.
negative for them.
Yeah, he's definitely been a negative, and it's like you said. I think it's surprising, especially due to the fact that it is Portland. This is not a pressure cooker environment. This is a low market, small market team where it's like not a lot's really going on up there, in terms of what they have going on this roster in general. So it is kind of weird to be seeing that high of a pick, be struggling like this. 8 games in. So I don't know. It is troublesome, I think. Like you said, the shooting is clearly not there, and that was a big question mark coming into the league. But that's something that we'd like to see develop, and we want the guy to succeed. But it has been very surprising to see him playing like this, and it's been bad. The memes have been bad. Everything has just been horrible. Like
Oh God,
they are not
yeah,
letting they're not letting up, and I feel
right.
bad. But at the same time, I think everybody's just equally as surprised as us because this was a guy touted as a generational talent. And they were saying if Wemby wasn't in this draft, Scoot would have been going number one. So it is kind of interesting to see how this unfolds. But I think, he has plenty of time. He has plenty of his career left as well. I think, and plenty of this season left. So hopefully he does turn this thing around and get that efficiency up, cut back on the turnovers, cut back on the fouls, and just play better defense. And it seems like it may be nerves. I don't know. It seems like he's just not focused sometimes. Like I think during the tip off of his first game, I think they tipped the ball off and then the ball kind of just went right past his head and then he delayed, reacted, and then just kind of like ran into the um, scorers table or whatever. So just overall weird moments like that don't make me feel good and just have me surprised. So I
Right.
agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was debating on my last surprise whether to go positive or negative. I think I'm gonna go positive. I'm gonna shout out Indiana. This is a team I'm not even really a fan of in general. But overall, Indiana has definitely surprised me. I think we talked about it earlier. Their roster is good. Um, Tyrese Halliburton has taken that leap. Benedict Mathurin seems to be turning it around somewhat. Healed has looked okay, but the Bruce Brown signing has definitely been paying off for sure. And then, they have other guys that I feel like do need to play, in terms of Jerace Walker. But at the same time, if they're winning, there's no real need to play him at that point. Maybe they're just looking for some, keep your head down, practice, and get better kind of vibes. I'm not sure. But the talent is definitely there. And then obviously you have Miles Turner as well. So I think this team might be one of those squads where they can like sneak in and make like a interesting little playoff run because I think they've taken Cleveland's spot at this point early in the season because Cleveland has struggled tremendously. I know there's been some issues and injuries, underwhelming performances, but also some stellar performances from Donovan Mitchell. But not enough to get them over the hump because Garland's not there sometimes, and then obviously Mobley hasn't played up to the standard that we know that he can play at, and then Allen being out. It's just a whole mess down there. But with Indiana, I think they've risen to the occasion and gotten the early wins, which could make them, a prime playoff team in the East that's already kind of weak, but has gotten stronger in the past few months.
Yeah, I think the Pacers, and again, this was a team that I thought was going to be better. I wasn't
Sure.
sure like how much of a leap they were going to take, but I definitely thought like they made a lot of good moves. It's a team with a lot of young players, so there's a lot to like. But like you said, yeah, I think 6-3, is pretty solid. And
Yeah.
again, like some decent wins against some solid teams. Like you mentioned, Halliburton has been great. You've gotten a lot of good performances out of other guys, right? Miles Turner's played well, Obi
Yeah.
Toppin's played well, Bruce Brown has been good. Aaron Neesmith, right, who was a guy that Boston kind of just like, gave away, right? He's
Hmm.
been, really good for them. Um, even a guy like like TJ McConnell hasn't even really played. I can't remember if he's hurt or not, but like, they haven't, like he was, like their backup point guard
Sure.
for a while. Now, they're running a bunch of other guys, right? As I mentioned, Jarvis Walker hasn't even played
Right.
at all, and he was a top 10 pick. So there's definitely a lot to like about Indiana, right? They can score, at a ridiculous rate. And that's going to be tough for some teams because again,
Yeah.
like they like to play up and down. They got a lot of athletes at a lot of different positions. There are some spots where they're kind of small, but then other spots where they're kind of big. So I think there's a lot to like about this team.
Absolutely.
They've definitely looked, like a really fun team and the type of team where it's like maybe they don't necessarily win a playoff series, but it could be the type of team where like, if they get the right matchup, they could be, they could cause some trouble, for a team.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, they're a
not maybe
disruptor.
yeah, like it could just be a disruptor where it's like, oh, this team thought that they might have like a relatively, like easy first round matchup, and then like Indiana all of a sudden makes it go like 6 games,
Right.
maybe even like seven or something, because they just have like 2 or 3 straight games where like there's nothing you can do.
Right.
Again, we'll see what it looks like come playoff time, but either way, I think you have to be really pleased with what we've seen from Indiana so far. Because
Yeah.
again, that's a team that I thought would be better, and they definitely have been better for sure,
Yeah.
even better than I thought personally.
Because like even if we look at it, I know this is not how sports work, but if the playoffs started today, Indiana would be facing what Orlando in the playoffs. So it's like I feel like Indiana would probably have a better shot um at making it farther than Orlando. You know what I mean? So I feel like they're in a position where they can beat a lot of really really good teams just because their offense is on a historically great level.
Yeah. And you got a guy in Halliburton that's like a, an orchestrator, right? In the
Exactly.
sense of like, he's got like, some traditional throwback point guard elements to him in terms of like how he can just control the
Yeah,
offense.
he's so
And then
traditional.
And then you add in the fact that he's got size and he can shoot, obviously,
Yeah.
right? Like it's an unorthodox shot, but it works. And when it
Yes.
works, I mean, it goes crazy. So
Yeah.
I mean,
It's ridiculous.
yeah, right. So shout out to, Indiana for having a really good season so far.
Yeah.
Again, like, because it's been a little up and down, but overall, I think there's been way more positives than negatives, right?
I
Like, I mean,
agree.
they're averaging 26 points, 126 points a game, which is number one in the NBA. Now they're giving up over 120, right? 122 a game, but again, it's a young team.
Yeah.
You don't expect it to be a crazy good defensive team. It's the type of team where again, they're going to probably win a lot of regular season games like a Sacramento and depending on the matchup, they could be very plucky, but probably, first round is probably the ceiling. But if you're Indiana, I mean, that's better than what it would have been the last couple of seasons where they were,
Exactly.
like either play in or worse.
Yeah. This
And
is
then
what
it's
they want.
definitely better in terms of it feels like you have a brighter future than those Indiana teams post Paul George,
True.
where he was gone. And they still went to the first round, but there wasn't a lot to write home about, right? You had the one team with Oladipo where it looked like he was on the rise, and then he got hurt. So then he was gone, and then the teams they had after that, it was like Turner and Sabonis, and it was okay, but I
Yeah.
think this
Nothing.
is the
Nothing crazy.
yeah, this is the team of the
Yeah.
future. I think
This
if
is
you're
the one.
Indiana, not like the NBA future. I just mean like for the Pacers.
Right. Yeah.
This is a better future than what it would have been, with the previous
Yeah. This is
version.
looking really good for them.
Yeah. So I think with my last one, I think I'm gonna be a little more negative than you,
Okay.
in terms of like what to close with, and I feel like in terms of the surprise, it's gonna be Lamelo Ball.
Okay.
Um,
Interesting.
Now it's a small sample size for sure because it is 7 games, but I feel like he's just been bad. Like you look at his numbers, you know, 19.6 points, 5 rebounds, 9 assists. That seems fine, but then it's like 38% from the field, 32% from three. He's taken 8 threes a game, 17 shots. It just doesn't look good
Four
out there, and I mean.
turnovers.
Yeah, 4 turnovers. And again, like I'm not blaming him, completely for Charlotte's struggles because it's not like Charlotte is a great team. And they've also had some bad injury luck, right? Like Rozier, began the season, he played relatively well, and now he's hurt, right? And he's, obviously their other guard that they have alongside of
Yeah.
him. Bridges, he's out, obviously, so that hurts as well. But they're 1-4. They've had a couple of games where like, maybe they could have won, but they ended up not, but either way, I'm a little bit disappointed in what I've seen from him so far because I feel like, now in year 4, I'd like to see a little bit of growth there. But again, like it's also like kind of a bare bones ish sort of team at times, but they still have some talent on there, right? Like, Gordon Hayward's there. I'm not sure if he played in the last game, but still he's been relatively healthy and productive. Brandon Miller's been pretty good as a rookie, right? Mark Williams has been really good.
Hmm.
PJ Washington's out there playing relatively well. So it's not like they have nobody.
Right.
But it does feel like I need to see some better performances out of him, right? He just got that new big $200 million plus contract. And I just feel like he's been underwhelming. And, I feel like if he kind of turns a corner, right, where like, he gets out of that slump, I think, Charlotte may be able to be a little bit better. Because he had a game, um, I think recently, I think in his last game, right, he had 34 and 7, and
Yes.
he was 13 of 22, right? So that's a much better performance. They still ended up losing. I think it was to the Wizards.
Yes, it was. Watch
But
that game.
yeah, yeah, but still, like just in general, like I feel like he's not been very underwhelming. But again, 7 game sample size is small. You know, I can't imagine he's going to shoot that bad for the whole season. I
Yeah.
mean, but regardless, I'd like to see a step up, especially because again, we're in year what 4, I think at this point now, right? So
Yeah, he was drafted in
yeah,
2020.
right.
So yeah, I
And
think
so
year
it's like,
4.
yeah, and exactly. And you look at the top 3 picks, right? You had Edwards, right? He's been really good, this season. Then you have Wiseman, who looks like he might be on his way out of the league.
Yeah.
It's not even playing for Detroit. And then you have Lamelo, who I feel like um, looked really good his rookie year. And then his second year, looked, he's an all-star, I think, in year 2, right? Or was it year
Yes.
3?
I think it
It
was
was
year
year
2.
2.
I think it was year 2
He was
because
an
he only
all-star.
played 36 games last year.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so yeah, exactly. My bad. Yeah, he
Yeah.
was an all-star his second season and looked like he was on the rise, like as like a really, really good up and coming point guard. But
Sure.
since then it's been rough. And again, like injuries played a part last year, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I just haven't liked a lot of what I've seen. Like, again, he's not shooting 11 threes a game. But he is still shooting 8, and I think he's on a minutes restriction if I'm not mistaken. I
I
don't know if
believe
he
so,
still is,
yeah.
but he was. So I don't know. Like I'd like to see some better production, and I don't know if we'll get like if we'll get it. Like I think it'll be more efficient, but
Mhm.
still, I don't know. Something about him just seems kind of off.
I agree. In watching the Wizards game, I think that was last night. Yeah, I think it was last night. Yeah. I was kind of confused because I feel like the one gripe that I've had with his game, and that's been since high school, is I always thought he lacked his game. Not even him. His game lacked the maturity because I feel like he has the potential to be, one of the last true PGs point guards in the game right now because he is averaging 9 assists, and I love that for him. He's third in assists right now. Um, but the problem is that efficiency. There's just some boneheaded shots that don't make sense. Like you were saying, I think the last time we talked about LaMelo Ball, he was taking 11 threes per game pretty much. Like, I don't think that's sustainable, not for him. I think his jump shot isn't, as consistent as you would want it to be, especially being that third pick and being the point guard and being the focal point of the offense. But with guys out, and then he's the best player on this team, and he hadn't really played like it in
Right.
my opinion. I think that's the problem. He's the best player on the team, but sometimes he does not play like it because shooting 38% from the field is rough. I think, especially in your fourth year coming off a contract year. It's surprising because normally when guys get the contracts, we kind of expect them to take leaps sometimes,
Always,
like
they don't always do it.
but sometimes they do, get complacent and take a step back, which is what you don't want to see. But this is surprising considering that he was off to such a great start to his career because I feel like every year there was some form of improvement in his game, whether it be his rookie year going from 15 points to 20, and then last year going from 20 to 23, although he only played 36 games. It is unfortunate, and I'd like to see him pick it up because I think he does have the potential to be a really, really good player. Especially, on Charlotte, man. Come on, you're the best player on Charlotte. That simple as that. That's the only thing that I have to say. And he hadn't played like it.
Like, yeah, exactly. That's how I feel, about that. Just because, again, like, at this point, I think you gotta like we kind of need to see something in terms of like again, like you mentioned, he's kind of the guy that's been posed as like the future of the Hornets, right? They just paid him, they just took care of him, and I think he needs to be better. And again, like
Sure.
Charlotte's been in a weird situation the last couple of years, right? With guys, being in and out, either due to injuries or off the court stuff or whatever, right? They just had, you know, two guys that they drafted right in the lottery, right? Like one of them they cut, and then the other guy will probably not be back once his contract is up, right? One in Kai Jones, and then the other in James Booknight,
Right.
right? So there's been
Forgot
some
about
bad,
Book Night.
but
Goodness gracious.
yeah, yeah, like there's been some bad breaks, but there still is talent on this team. Like I don't know, but it hasn't clicked, and I think he's been a part of that. And I feel like
Yeah.
if he plays better, I think that will go a long way in terms of Charlotte looking like a more competent team. Because again, that's not going to cut it. Because
Sure.
shooting under 40% from the field, and under 40% from three at 6'7" or whatever, and getting a ton of turnovers and
It's not
defensively
good.
yeah, still not making a whole lot of progress there. Like it's just not good enough, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
It doesn't mean that everybody should be out on him, but again, year 4 is a little bit
And it's
kind
just
of
early
surprising.
surprises. That's all this is. It's not like we're writing anybody off. We're just surprised by all of these things that have occurred so far in this season.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So that's all I'm saying. And
Yeah.
again, and just just to kind of end it on a semi more positive note, just
Sure.
as an honorable mention in terms of a surprise, I just wanted to shout out Cole Anthony, who I think has played very well this
Absolutely.
season. And
And that was a guy
you know,
that we thought they might let him, walk potentially or move
yeah, we
him.
thought that they might move him. He
Yeah.
might be one of the guys that gets moved, but they gave him an extension, and he's a guy where they gave him the extension, and he's rewarded them
Yes.
by playing the best basketball of his career and being a
Yeah.
big part of why Orlando is where they're at right now. Right,
Yeah.
16 a game, 48 from the field, 42 from three, 4 rebounds, right, 3 assists. Again, he's been really good. So
Yeah. He
just an
looks great.
honorable mention, but
Yeah.
still like
I can get
just
down with
shout him
that.
out. He's been really good. And again, we can't shout out everybody
Right.
because it would
Right.
take 1,000 hours,
Yeah.
but those are our surprises, I think, so
Yeah.
far. Yeah. So now, I guess to close it out, a couple news and rumors, right? Things going on. Not a whole lot, necessarily to talk about. We did have a thing with Andre Iguodala. It seems like he's gonna temporarily, I guess, kind of take over as the executive person for the Players Association. Right.
Right.
The previous she stepped down. So now he's gonna I guess, kind of take the reins, until they find a successor, I guess.
Hmm.
This is a guy that we recently talked about, right? Because he retired, not that long ago.
Yeah, I think it was about two
I
weeks
think
ago.
he's gonna. Yeah, exactly. He's a guy that I think we both feel like should and will be in the Hall of Fame.
Yep.
And he's a guy that also has, kind of been like a guy that's done a lot of leadership stuff, and now he's got the opportunity to do this, until they sort some stuff out. So,
Right.
just kind of something to report.
Yeah, I saw that notification earlier, and I was like, "Huh, that's good for him." I like that. He seems like a mature guy. Never met him, but he seems really cool. And I think his accolades speak for himself, and I'm glad that he's doing something basketball related, outside of playing basketball in the NBA. So that's really cool. Still close to the game.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's the main thing. It's going to be interesting to see how that continues to go. New notification: Eric Bledsoe returns to the Chinese Basketball Association Shanghai Sharks.
Okay.
Kind of a small thing, I guess, but it is interesting because again, like we're kind of at a point now where we have some of these guys, um, who were big parts of NBA rosters, and now they're out of the league, and
Hmm.
playing elsewhere, right? Like I think DeMarcus Cousins, I believe, is playing overseas, right? Bledsoe's playing overseas. I think Whiteside, that's another guy that's overseas,
Dwight
and again,
Howard.
these were guys kind of, in a way, sort of grew up watching, I think, right?
Yeah, Dwight Howard too. I mean, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah,
All the transitions that people have made over the years, and it's not like it's a sad thing at all because they're still getting paid and they're still playing, basketball, and then they go over there and turn into beasts. So, it's not all tears, but it is kind of interesting, I think, to watch, the transition from them being, semi-stars or like you said, important players on franchises that have won some titles, and then once they're out of the league, they just go and ball somewhere else.
right. Yeah, exactly. And then like, just, one last thing or, a couple of last things, just to point out, just, a ton of injuries going on around the NBA.
Yeah.
Pretty much, just about, almost every team, pretty much has at least a couple of guys out. And I mean, it's pretty brutal. And like some of these, teams, have key guys out, right? And, that's just been a tough thing, to talk about. Cause again, like we've mentioned with a lot of these teams, some of it's hard to kind of, figure out in terms of where some of these teams are at because, they're without a number of guys, right? Like we talked about teams like a Brooklyn, teams like, a Lakers or, even like a Memphis or, now like a Miami, New Orleans got, teams like that. It's pretty brutal. I mean, like you're talking about some of these teams are down like multiple starters.
Yeah.
And or like say like a team like a Phoenix, right? Like they've had, what? Like I don't think they've had a single game, right, where all three of their main guys have played, right?
Yeah,
Like,
and Beal just debuted, I think, what,
yeah,
yesterday?
exactly. Yeah, Beal just debuted. He finally came back, and now it's like, but now Booker's still, out.
Right.
He's got a different injury, and now he's out, and we don't know when he'll be back. So,
Yeah.
it's just been a rough start for the NBA in terms of like the injuries. I think the overall basketball still has been very good, from a lot of teams, but just the injuries just really stink. And
Yeah.
like it seems like not the list isn't necessarily getting better, right? Because now you got to add guys like Jamal Murray to the list, right? Guys like I just mentioned, Tyler Hero to the list.
Yeah.
Even like a guy like an Anthony Davis to the list,
Yep.
right? And I don't know if he'll be out for long, but still, just a number of names that you got to keep in mind and look out for. Because again, like it's just been rough.
Yeah. And then also just even the guys that are day to day, it's like, goodness. I mean, some of them are really impactful players. And then, when they're not there, you can see that some of these rosters are like really, really pushing it in terms of the depth that they do have. So it is kind of unfortunate to see the way that injuries do impact the game, but it is a part of the game. And that's the unfortunate reality that we do have to deal with when we're talking about basketball.
Right. Yeah. Like a Jared Vanderbilt, who's not like a star, but like he was a
Sure.
guy, that was out, from preseason. And, he played one preseason game and he was listed as day to day. And it's like, it's been like a month or
Right.
however long
So
it's
it's like,
been.
what's going on?
Yeah, like I mean, I don't think we've like even seen him in like what, like I think what was yeah, whenever our first podcast about preseason was, it's basically been like a month.
Yeah, that's
And
wild.
like you said, the day to day guys. I think now he's just listed as out, but like a lot of day to day guys, even like a guy like a Shengun, right? Like we
Right.
just he played the other night. We just talked about him, and now he's day to day,
Right.
um, with ankle injuries. So it's
And
like
like
it's just
Scoot
rough.
didn't play, I think, on like Wednesday or something. So it's
Right, exactly.
everybody's
So
been getting hit with the injury bug.
yeah, and we just
Varying
mentioned.
degrees of severity, obviously. But
Right, and we just mentioned even like a Mason Plumlee, right? Who
Yeah,
again, not a star, but a guy who I think does play a role for that Clippers team, and he's
exactly.
going to be out for at least a couple of months, right? Because of an injury, like it's
Yeah,
just rough. So I
yeah,
mean, Wendell Carter Jr. I'm not going to name everybody, but I'm
sure.
just saying like
A
Robert
lot of
Williams, who
impact
was
players.
Robert Williams, who we
Oh yeah,
hadn't
that's a big
mentioned
one.
yet, right? He just got an injury where I think he's going to be out for what 2 to 3 months, right? Because he had a surgery to repair. I think he had like a knee injury, right? Yeah, he had a
Hmm.
knee injury. He has to have a cleanup procedure, and he's going to be out for like a couple months.
Right.
I mean, Walker Kessler, right? Who we hadn't mentioned, and we had actually left out and sort of forgotten about when we were talking about like our guys that were slumping because he had
Oh
been in
yeah.
a slump.
True.
And he
True.
hadn't played well, and then he gets hurt.
Right.
Um, that's another key guy, right? Like that's a guy that was a big part of Utah's rotation. He's a starter, and now he's going to be out for at least a couple of weeks. So
Yeah.
De'Aaron Fox, right? That's a guy for Sacramento who you could argue is their best player, and he's hasn't played
Yeah.
in what 4 or 5 games or something like
Yeah.
that. So I mean,
And then
again,
now
like it,
Draymond, like the list
yeah,
goes on and on. That's how many
yeah,
injuries there are. It's
yeah.
ridiculous.
CJ McCollum. I
Yeah.
mean, Damian Lillard now is out.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, again, he's day to day, so maybe he only misses 1 game, but
But
like
still,
still, like
he's
I mean,
still out.
yeah, exactly. I mean, Memphis. I mean, we've already talked about them. Where like half their guys, have some type of injury going on. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
tough. And I don't really know what you do about it. If you're those type of teams. I mean, like because again, it's like it's so many impact guys. It's not like it's only guys that are kind of like end of bench guys. It's
Right.
it's everybody. So it's like
Yeah.
so a lot of these teams are going to have to find ways,
To combat it.
kind of yeah, to combat it and make do. But it's hard because again, like some of these guys are big time impact guys, right? Like for
Right.
Denver, like they're gonna miss Jamal Murray. Like that doesn't mean that Denver is gonna lose a bajillion games, but it does put a lot more pressure on the guys that they have right now. And then it's like that might maybe those guys their minutes have to go up, and then maybe they might unfortunately strain themselves or something like that. You know what I mean? Like so, it's
Yeah.
just something to keep in mind. Um, so and it's weird because again, like we had the load management thing where the thought process was no, well now guys are gonna have to play, but like it doesn't seem like anything's changed. It seems like guys are still getting hurt, guys are still having to miss time. Now, I don't think people are like faking injuries or like
Right.
just
Right.
choosing to sit out, but just in general, like it's been rough.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing. And injuries, I don't know. They're just tough to talk about because they happen so frequently. And
Right.
the problem is I feel like we as fans are definitely numb to it, and can be insensitive at times as well. So, hoping everybody does get better. And it is unfortunate to see this widespread of an injury bug this early in the season, although it is kind of somewhat normal at this point.
Exactly. That's kind of the thing where it's just like you said, it just kind of feels business as usual, but
Right.
it's still something where it's like you notice it because you're just looking at a lot of teams. You're just seeing like, holy crap, like these guys are not playing. So
Exactly.
that's tough, unfortunately. So,
Yeah.
but again, like this is not like a one team thing. Everybody has to deal with injuries at some point, and that's
Yeah.
kind of why like winning is difficult. Because already we're at a point where there's a lot more parity, and there's not really any more like just like throng of teams where it's like oh there's 5 to 7 teams that are all just tanking and that all
Right.
just stink, right? Like now there's a lot of even the quote unquote bad teams like on any given night could beat the crap out of you, right? Like
Yeah.
we've seen with this a team like the Spurs who don't have a good record, but on any given night they could just kind of just go in and just beat you by like 20 points.
Yeah. Good
um
point.
Even a team like the Wizards, I know they don't have like a ton of wins, but like
Yeah.
they could still just kind of just come in and just come out of nowhere and
Yeah.
just beat you.
And the problem with
Just
the Wizards is our schedule has been like so odd. Well, not odd, but hard, I would say, because we played a lot of like good teams and teams that have been on fire. The only two wins that we have are against Charlotte and Memphis. So it's like you got to look at that and it's like, okay, yeah, we can beat probably the worst teams, but once we come up against a good team, it's going to be hard. And I think scheduling is also probably another factor as well.
yeah, and again that's the main thing. And then like one last thing, which is kind of random. So according to Shams, there's been some potential talk about the idea of maybe having the first and second round on 2 different days. Um,
Draft?
yeah, the draft,
I don't
which
like
I think
that.
is yeah, which is kind of different. I mean,
No,
I don't
I
feel
wouldn't do
like you
that.
necessarily have to do it because, like, I mean, I guess part of it could be like, draft night is kind of long. where it goes from like, excuse
Bless
me,
you.
like like what, 7 to 12? Because we did a live stream of the draft, and I think we were kind of
We were
getting through
gassed.
it. Yeah, we were gassed,
Yeah.
but just in general, I don't know, because like it's not like the NFL where there's like a bajillion rounds. There's only two,
That's my
so
point. There's no need to space it out. Like in the NFL, I think there's at least I think 7 rounds. I think 7 rounds is the max in the NFL. So it's like, yeah, there's no way you could do that in one day. I think they do it in 3 days or 2 days. I can't remember. But yeah, I don't think they need to space it out. I think they just need to get it over with and just, do it in one
but they
day.
did say, the reasoning behind it is potentially just because of the fact that like it would allow teams to kind of, I guess, prepare a little bit better, like in between the first and the second rounds, where it's
Are
like,
you kidding
okay,
me?
yeah, where it's like, okay, now the first round is over and now it's day two. So now like we know, who's on the board or whatever. We have more time to prepare and do
I don't think
whatever.
I
So
don't think that's necessary, but that could just be me.
yeah, I mean, again, yeah, I don't think it has to be,
Yeah,
done, because again, like, I mean, it is long for sure,
I
but like
agree.
at the same time, I don't feel like the draft itself is long enough where it needs to be like multiple days,
Yeah,
because it's just
there's not
rounds.
enough.
Again,
There's not enough rounds. If it
right?
was like three
Yeah,
or four, okay, cool, 2 and 2.
yeah, because back in the day, way back, I mean, the NBA had more than two rounds. They would have like three, four, five, or whatever, how many rounds.
Hmm.
But now it's just two, with 60 picks. So it's like
Right,
I just don't feel like that's long enough where you need to stretch it out over 2 days.
I agree.
But you could also make the argument where it's like, well, now that allows for all the picks to get a little bit more shine, right? Where you won't have a situation where like Nikola Jokic gets drafted during like a Taco Bell
Okay,
commercial.
yeah, I get that, but at the same time, is it really necessary? I don't think it's a necessary change. I think it would be
Right.
an interesting change, and I wouldn't be,
Yeah.
completely opposed to it, but I don't think it's necessary. It's not like, game
Right.
breaking or anything like that.
There's other things that I would probably change,
Yeah, exactly.
before that,
Can we
but
lower the saturation on the courts, for the in-season tournament, please? Because
or
that
maybe
that
have
that would be a nice change.
yeah, or maybe like some of the jerseys, maybe you could do something with that, because I feel like what was it? It was the city editions or whatever jerseys. I can't, whichever ones. Those got heavily panned, if I'm not mistaken.
Which the
Uh,
one are those from this year or last year?
I think it's the ones from this year that were like recently put out, and a lot of
Oh
people
yeah,
seem like
yeah.
to have.
People hated them. They were like, "Yeah, these are not good." I don't really have a problem with them. I think the only one I have a problem with was maybe the Bucks or the Heat. I think that it was the Heat one. It just says Heat culture. Like that's all it says. I'm like, y'all can
Right.
get a little bit more creative than that. Like the Wizards, they had a good one last year, which was like the cherry blossom one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, but it is kind of interesting because again, like I mean, there's always room, for improvement and adding extra things. But yeah, the draft thing was definitely kind of something that surprised me
Yeah, I
a
don't
little
like
bit.
that one.
It's just not something I'd ever really heard anybody, think of. Because like some of the other stuff, like an in-season tournament, like people have talked about that,
Sure.
for a while. I'm not sure people have talked about it like a quote unquote play-in, but like some of the other stuff, that people have discussed. That's something that we've heard before, and I think like they also discussed the idea of having coaches be in that prize pool where like they get money as well, which is like
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of interesting. Um, but again, it's different. So, but like you said, I don't feel like the draft thing really is like we don't have to do that. But I do
Yeah.
understand. Like I wouldn't like be opposed to it and like completely hate it.
Right.
If they end up doing it, but it's not something where I'm like, yeah, this is a must do. Like we have
Yeah.
to fix this.
I agree.
Yeah. So, well, yeah, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, a lot of content to discuss.
Yeah.
In terms of the last, week or so of the NBA. Obviously, like I said, we're 3 weeks in. We have the continuation of the in-season tournament. If you're watching this, if you're watching this on Friday, right, you're gonna have the continuation of the in-season tournament. Not long after you watch this podcast. So again, appreciate the support. Let us know your thoughts on everything we've talked about thus far. In terms of the surprises, maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Follow us on TikTok as well as Instagram. And we'll see you next week.